Good morning, English students. I wanted to look at several research paper samples. My last video talked about ways to structure the research paper, and you could look at that first. And then I wanted to talk about these four sample papers from students to talk about what's going well or maybe what they could have done differently. And then in terms of MLA formatting, none of these are perfect, so I have this one here that isn't related to the content that we're doing, but the MLA formatting is absolutely correct. So I would look at this one if you have questions about MLA formatting. In terms of these four samples, each of these had a similar assignment to what you guys are working on. The fourth one here is actually about God Help the Child. This first one is related in that it's a Toni Morrison novel, and we did look at the synthesis paragraphs that this student developed last week when we were writing that, and so you may recognize some of the material from those paragraphs. The next one is an assignment where the students had a primary source where they gathered the primary source was a fake news story, and then their task was similar to yours where they were validating or exposing the flaws in that writer's depiction of that particular story. This one that says Crash was about a movie titled Crash, and students were then to go in and pick one of the themes from the movie and evaluate the film's depiction of that particular theme. So very similar assignment to ours. And then finally, this one from God Help the Child, where the student chose a theme from the novel and was validating Morrison's depiction of that theme. So I want to look through each of these and talk about some of the merits and maybe struggles that the writers had. This first one, you'll notice, has a cover letter. I am asking for you guys to do a cover letter with your final draft, not the draft that we're working on this week or the one you bring to conferences, but the final draft that you turn in. And you'll notice that this writer has done that. They've evaluated kind of their process, talked about how the different steps in the research process help them. Here they talk about the literature review. That is similar to those synthesis paragraphs that we did in class last week. And so you guys will do something similar in your cover letter, evaluating the whole research process. Here they finally say, even though the research paper was a lengthy process, I'm satisfied with my final work because it helped me improve my writing skills, such as embedding quotes and connecting four different sources back to the main source or primary source, Toni Morrison. So you don't need the cover letter right now, but by the time you turn in the final copy, I'll have you guys do the same sort of cover letter. This one is the one where the writer was looking at the bluest eye to evaluate education and determine how well Morrison had done with that particular theme. Here in the opening paragraph, the writer says, Americans across the nation have valued and continue to value education. Throughout history, the education system has constantly changed to adapt alongside American culture. In Toni Morrison's novel, The Bluest Eye, the protagonist, Pecola Breedlove, helps unravel the issue of education that affects other characters throughout the novel, such as Claudia McTeer and Geraldine. And so here the writer is introducing the scenes and characters that they'll be looking at from the novel. You guys may have this information in your research proposal, and this writer probably did as well, and so they're using that information to help form the introduction. They go on to establish their answer to the prompt. Morrison is implicit with this theme throughout the novel, only explaining it through the stories of few characters. Further research, so here the writer has combined Morrison's portrayal of the theme with the research that the writers gathered. Further research helps analyze how the quality of education affects African American children based on race, class, and gender. Here, I think the writer could have combined these sentences maybe with a comma, demonstrating that the quality of education has impacted and continues to impact African American children in succeeding academically. Here, I think they added this sentence to try to help explain why the novel is still relevant for today's readers. But I think combining that would make this clear, and we wouldn't need a 3-sentence thesis statement. So here, I think 2-sentence thesis statement is fine, so I would recommend to this writer that they combine here. Following this introduction paragraph, we get background on issues of segregation at the time the novel takes place, and so the writer here talks about Brown versus Board of Education and brings in one source here by Cheney that describes the segregation issues, which the writer will then connect to the novel. We get another source here by Gentry and Peel talking about the curriculum in African American schools as compared to more white schools. And then the writer sort of wraps up that background information. Next, the writer connects Morrison and what she's doing in the novel. Toni Morrison briefly references the issue of segregation in her novel through the character Geraldine, and then explains to us what's going on, what that connection is. The writer also gives some analysis, though through Geraldine, Morrison depicts segregation, an issue that separated the African American community. So a little bit of analysis, probably they could have done more with it, but they have connected it to Morrison. In the next 2 paragraphs that follow, the writer has not made connections with Morrison. They're just summarizing information from their sources about African Americans' academic achievement. One thing that this writer could have done better was to indicate that maybe this was an issue that Morrison ignored or failed to look at, and explained why it's important, and then given information from the sources. But here we sort of lose connection with the novel. The writer does bring back in Morrison after this by talking about socioeconomic status and how Morrison depicts that through Maureen Peel's character, and we get a lot more analysis connected to the book here. But I think one weakness in this paper is that at some points we're not quite clear what the connections with the novel were, and the writer hasn't explained to us that Morrison failed to depict this important subject, and that's why they're explaining this information to us. At the end, in the conclusion, I think we get connecting back to what's happening today, why readers should still read this, and connections with Morrison and what she's depicting and why it's still representative. Again, the writer talks about what's going on, describes what Morrison's doing, and then connects in her research. One thing that research has emphasized is that race, class, and gender may be factors that affect the quality of education, but individuals themselves are capable of succeeding academically. Following the paper, we can see the writer's works cited page, which is in alphabetical order. Spacing is a little bit off. Everything should be double spaced. There shouldn't be any extra space in between here, but the writer is using the hanging indent. And for the time period that this writer was writing in, the MLA style was slightly different than what we're using now, and that entries are correct given the previous MLA guidelines. So one thing that you might notice here is that the writer has listed the novel, the primary source. Here it was The Bluest Eye. For us it'll be God Help the Child. And then has listed every other source that she brought into the paper. On our guidelines, I believe I'm asking you guys to have 4 sources plus the novel. Here, I think this writer has 5 sources plus the novel. And that's fine. I think you need to list every source that you use in your paper. Okay, so the next sample paper, this one is the one about fake news story. I think what's interesting about this particular paper, and what I want you guys to note, is that it has a 2-page or 2-paragraph introduction, and so I wanted to read through and talk about that. One thing that is off here is on your title and MLA style, it should not be underlined, it should just be plain text, and so keep that in mind. So with this paper, the writer first gives some background on the subject of fake news. Fake news is when the media gives out incorrect or misleading information pertaining to a certain topic. Fake news tends to have a bit of bias, clickbait, or deceiving titles to lure in the readers. Language is also a big part of fake news. It usually tries to make the reader feel and react in some type of way. And then they reveal that they have a particular fake news story that they're going to be looking at and what it's about. So one thing that we might expect in this paper is that the writer is going to investigate language and the sort of bias in the fake news story. In the second introduction paragraph, we get more details and kind of a summary of the fake news source, who wrote it, what it's about, what the title is, and this one happens to be a book review of a particular story. Then the writer leads into their thesis statement. This article is twisting the story about guests being invited to the White House and has an intense amount of slant. And so here the writer could have tied in their research and maybe said something like, my research indicates that this article is twisting the story. Here the students were also validating the primary source against what research had to say, just like you guys are doing with God Help the Child. So I think connecting the research to the primary source is important in the thesis, which this one doesn't quite do. So make sure that you do that as you construct your thesis. This second paragraph gives a lot of background information about what's in the story. And so one objective of using sources might be background information. I think in the previous one we looked at, the writer gave some background information on Toni Morrison's book in the introduction, and you could probably position your background information wherever you feel it's easiest for your readers to understand. One thing that is not working well about this particular essay, after the background, the writer gets too into their process of investigating and their research process, and so you want to leave out that process part. Here they say, to start off my journey to discover if this is a fake story or not, I decided to research and find out more information. Well, this is a research paper, so we know that you are researching. So here what they might have done instead is talk about how there are several reliable sources that give information about the same topic that this fake news story is covering, and then go into ABC News seemed to be more trustworthy than the fake news story, and then give that information and evaluate which they finally do. But I think one thing you want to leave out is leave out your research process. That's assumed. One other thing I think that may be working well about this is on, I think it's on the third page, this paragraph that starts, Howe and Weed claim that the Clintons sold sleepovers at the White House, which isn't the case at all. So here they're saying this fake news story claimed this. And then they say this isn't the case, and they back that up with evidence from the other more reliable sources they were able to gather on the same story. And so if you're making claims that Morrison depicted this theme accurately or inaccurately, you want to take the same sort of stance. Pick one piece or one subtopic to evaluate, and then bring in your evidence and connect it to what Morrison shows so that you can explain why she's accurate or inaccurate. In this sample also, there are some troubles with the works cited page. This one had a lot of spacing problems, although this particular one is in the newer MLA guidelines, so it might be a better source for that. One thing that this writer has done is, oh, they do have enough sources. Sorry, I was thinking they did not, but they have 1, 2, 3, 4 sources, and then this was their fake news story here. And so you want to make sure that you include all of your sources as well as Toni Morrison's novel. The next student sample that I wanted to look at is this one, which this is the one that looked at the movie Crash to see if this idea of, in this case, the theme of affirmative action was accurately portrayed in the film. So here the writer has immediately used one of their sources in the opening to give us a definition. This writer also structures this as a 2-paragraph introduction. And so in the first paragraph, they've defined terms, they've defined what affirmative action means, and they talk about how it's been the policy for over 40 years. They say, I feel that affirmative action has run its course, but maybe they should have tied this to their research. Much research shows that affirmative action has run its course and should be reevaluated. And then they move on to bringing in their primary source, the film Crash, and talk about how they briefly touch on this topic in one scene. This writer, I think, was taking the approach to the research paper that they were going to expand on something that the movie didn't fully discuss. It brings up but doesn't do a good job of presenting. And so here they've briefly summarized what happens in the movie, which characters and scenes are involved in this particular theme. And they end with, I don't think the film went on to resolve this conflict at all. The scene ended and the viewer was left hanging, maybe even a little confused. I don't think the film I do think the film represented some grievances white people feel about affirmative action today. And so they have said maybe it somewhat represents what's going on, but it didn't give the viewer enough information. And so then in the course of the paper, the writer attempts to give more information. One thing with this paper that I think was a problem with the first paper that we discussed is that we're getting kind of a dump of information but no connection with the primary source, the film. And so here again, this writer could have better connected with the film. I think this next paragraph gives background on affirmative action, but then after that, they need to make more connection with the film, doing things like, in the film, the characters just barely discuss this, and here's what the real situation is, so that you're making connections as you move through. I think once they get through a couple of pages of kind of dumping information at us, then they do come back to the film and bring it back in here, probably on the 5th page, and discussing how it brought up more questions. I think one other weakness in this particular research paper is this writer is using I frequently. I think, I feel. And one thing you want to make sure that you do with this research paper is to explain what your research shows, present it in an objective manner. The work cited for this particular paper is missing the primary source. So this person has their 4 sources, but they're missing the film Crash, which they've obviously used within the paper, but they failed to cite it on their works cited. So that's one other thing that you want to make sure that you capture. Especially since your annotated bibliography, if you're transferring sources over from that, you're still going to need to add God Help the Child since it wasn't on your original. Okay, one last paper, and this one actually deals with God Help the Child. This writer was looking at the theme of place and community in God Help the Child, and they start with some of the first memories many of us have is with those that are closest to us in a place that is familiar and significant. From the moment we are able to comprehend our surroundings, and even before that, we create bonds and attachments to the objects, frameworks, and people around us. These attachments can be both positive and negative, which in turn has implications later in life. All the connections we make throughout our lives with the places and community around us, especially when we are young, form aspects of who we are, whether we like it or not. And so they've given a lot of background information about the theme that they're working on. It is this relationship that is prevalent in Toni Morrison's book, God Help the Child. So here they tell us that Morrison also deals with this theme. One thing I think that is maybe a weakness in this type of thesis is they haven't really evaluated how well does she present this theme. Yes, this theme is prevalent, but is she depicting it accurately, realistically? And so their thesis statement could better represent that evaluation. Here in the next paragraph, they tell us Morrison weaves together a web of perspectives throughout the book, telling the story of a young woman and her struggle with society and friendship and love. Many aspects of the significance of place and community are relevant and clearly apparent within the novel, especially in the protagonist Lula Ann or Bride. So here they've given their evaluation. I think that one thing they could have done is possibly use this as their thesis statement, and then moved on to these other ideas, or use this as a 2-paragraph introduction maybe, and moved this thesis statement to the end of the 2nd paragraph. As this writer goes through the rest of their paper, I think one thing they've done is they've done a good job of connecting with Morrison at all points, I think, within the paper, and evaluating her in light of what their sources are saying. And so I think that's working well. In-text citations also are, I think, okay for the most part. Some things might have needed a little bit of help, like here with the indented quote, they could remove the quotation marks. But all of their sources are cited, and they've done a good job of connecting with the book throughout. On the works cited for this one, there are some spacing problems, but this one also is in the newer MLA guidelines, so it should look more like what you guys are using, and they've got God Help the Child and then their 4 other sources. So I hope this gives you some information on looking at the student research samples as you're thinking about structuring your paper and maybe some of the weaknesses that past papers have had and some of the strengths. So we'll try to talk more about this when you come to conferences with a draft of your paper, and let me know if you have questions. Thanks.